The house was old, older than most could remember. It had been abandoned for years, yet in the neighborhood there were whispers about the little girl who once lived there. They said she was sweet and shy, a delicate child with large, innocent eyes. But that was before she disappeared. The house sat on the edge of town, perched on a hill that overlooked the forest. The windows, though shattered, still reflected the light of the moon, casting long shadows over the overgrown garden and the rusted gate. It was a place everyone avoided, and for good reason. No one dared go near it after dusk. Lena had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. But she was different. Her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She was new to the area, having just moved into a small cottage with her family. The first time she saw the house, something stirred in her. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a strange pull toward it, an invisible thread drawing her in. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way about a place, but there was something different about this house. Her parents warned her to stay away from it, as had her new friends at school. But as the days went by, Lena couldn't help herself. She found herself standing at the edge of the property, staring at the crumbling facade of the house. There was a hollow emptiness about it, as if it had once been full of life, but now contained only silence. One evening, when the sun had set and the air grew cool, Lena decided to go inside. She told herself she was only going to peek, just to satisfy the growing curiosity that gnawed at her. She waited until her parents were occupied with something else, then grabbed a flashlight and slipped out the back door. The moonlight illuminated her path as she made her way through the dense trees surrounding the house. As Lena approached the front steps, her heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea why she was nervous. There was nothing particularly frightening about the house. But there was something in the air that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, something that made her feel like she was being watched. The door creaked open easily when she pushed against it. Dust and mildew filled her nostrils as she stepped into the darkness. Her flashlight flickered for a moment before it steadied, casting a weak beam of light over the interior. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she ventured further inside, the air thick with the smell of decay. She had expected the house to be empty, but something felt wrong. It was too still, too silent. There was an oppressive heaviness in the air, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. Lena's footsteps echoed loudly in the empty space. She shone the flashlight around, taking in the dilapidated walls, the peeling wallpaper, the shattered furniture. But there was something else, something out of place. On the far wall, a door stood ajar. It was different from the others, almost as if it had been left open on purpose. Lena felt a chill creep down her spine. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to go through it. As she walked toward the door, the silence seemed to deepen, pressing in on her from all sides. The light from her flashlight barely reached the other side of the room. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of her flashlight. At first she thought it was a child's room. There were toys scattered on the floor, a small bed with a faded quilt, and a rocking chair in the corner. But it was the crib that caught her attention. It was old, its wooden slats chipped and warped, but what made Lena's heart skip a beat was the figure standing beside it. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, stood perfectly still, her back to Lena. She wore a pale dress, almost white, and her long hair hung in tangles around her face. The girl didn't move, didn't even acknowledge Lena's presence. Lena froze, her pulse quickening. She had to have imagined it. The stories about the girl who lived here, could they be true? No, she had to be hallucinating. Maybe the house had gotten to her, the darkness playing tricks on her mind. But even as she told herself this, she knew something was wrong. "Hello," Lena called, her voice barely above a whisper. The little girl didn't respond. She just stood there, unmoving. Lena stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate. The air grew colder as she approached, and a low hum filled the room, like the soft sound of something breathing. She was almost there when the girl slowly turned to face her. Lena gasped, stumbling backward. The girl's face was pale, almost too pale, her eyes dark pools of emptiness. Her mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. And then Lena's breath hitched, her eyes shifted, as if they were following something Lena couldn't see. Before Lena could react, the girl smiled. It wasn't a smile of innocence. It was something darker, a twisted, mocking grin that sent a wave of terror through Lena's body. "You're not supposed to be here," the girl said, her voice a soft whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Lena's heart raced as she stumbled backward, her feet tangling in the debris. She tripped and fell, the flashlight slipping from her hand and spinning across the floor, casting wild, flickering shadows on the walls. The girl didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes locked onto Lena's, unblinking. Lena scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to get out. She had to leave. But when she turned to run, the door, her only escape, slammed shut with a deafening crash. She froze, terror gripping her heart. The girl's laugh echoed in the room, high-pitched and eerie, like the sound of a child playing a cruel game. Lena backed into a corner, her mind racing. She had to think. She had to get out. But everything seemed wrong, like the very walls of the house were shifting, closing in on her. The hum grew louder, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. Lena looked down at her feet and saw, with horror, that the floor was starting to shift, the wooden planks warping and twisting beneath her. The room seemed to stretch and contract, the walls bending inward like a living thing. "Why won't you play with me?" the girl whispered, her voice now so close it sent a shiver down Lena's spine. Lena felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there, only the girl's empty, hollow eyes staring at her from across the room. Suddenly the temperature dropped, and Lena could see her breath in the air. The room seemed to blur, as if the very reality of it was breaking down. The girl was no longer standing in the corner. She was directly in front of Lena, her face inches from hers, her breath cold and clammy against Lena's skin. "You shouldn't have come," the girl hissed, her grin widening impossibly. "Now you're mine." Lena screamed and lunged for the door, her hands desperate against the knob. It wouldn't budge. The house seemed to pulse, a living entity trapping her in its grasp. Then, through the window, Lena saw a flicker of light. It was her parents, or maybe it was someone else. She didn't know, but she had to get to them. With every ounce of strength, she threw herself against the door, pounding against it with her fists. The door opened. For a moment, Lena stood frozen in the doorway, her chest heaving with fear. She didn't want to look back. She didn't want to see what waited for her in the dark. But she had to. She turned. The girl was gone. The room was empty. Lena ran. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cool night air filling her lungs. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent once more. But Lena knew. She knew the truth. The girl was still there. And she was never going to leave. The whispers would never stop. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her, a shadow that clung to the edges of her mind. The moment she stepped outside, the weight of the house lifted, but only for an instant. The cool night air seemed to deepen the silence around her, like the world itself had been holding its breath, waiting. She looked back at the house, its dark silhouette looming against the backdrop of the forest. Her parents' flickering lantern light was now just a distant glimmer, but something else. Something darker had crept into the edges of her vision. The house was still watching her, still waiting. Lena's feet moved before her mind could process the impulse, and she ran. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as she sprinted through the trees, her flashlight now useless in her trembling hand. Her thoughts spun wildly as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Was it real? The girl, her eyes, her smile, it was like a nightmare made flesh. But no, it was real. She had felt it. That oppressive cold, the unnatural hum in the air. It can't be over, Lena thought, her pulse racing. It's not over. She reached the edge of the forest and emerged onto the path that led back to her cottage. Her parents' house was just up the hill, a small, cozy structure of wood and stone, but tonight it felt more like a prison than a safe haven. Lena felt like something was closing in, like the forest, the house. Everything was slowly turning against her. When she reached the front door, she hesitated. She could hear her parents inside, talking quietly, but there was a faint ringing in her ears, a hum, like a memory trying to surface. The door opened with a soft creak, and she stepped inside, trying to seem normal, to hide the terror gnawing at her insides. Her mother looked up from the kitchen, a frown on her face. "Lena, where have you been?" "We've been calling for you." Lena didn't respond right away. She couldn't make sense of the words. She wanted to tell them everything, but she couldn't speak of it, not yet. What if they didn't believe her? What if the house, the girl, came after them too? "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice a little too breathless, a little too high-pitched. "I just went for a walk." Her father, who had been sitting at the table reading, looked at her over the top of his glasses. "It's late, sweetie. You shouldn't wander off like that. You know about the old house on the hill, right? People say strange things happen out there. Your mum and I have been meaning to warn you." Lena's stomach churned. The stories, the ones that had made her curious, that had drawn her into the house in the first place, now felt like a warning she should have heeded. The girl, she thought. The girl's still out there. She turned her gaze toward the window. There, in the dark, she thought she saw something move, a shadow, just at the edge of the garden. But when she blinked, it was gone. "Lena," her father's voice cut through her thoughts. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" She nodded quickly, too quickly, her mind racing. "It's just your imagination. The house is empty now. It can't hurt you." But that wasn't true, was it? The girl had been real, and the girl had followed her. "I'm fine," she whispered, almost to herself. "I'm fine." She didn't feel fine, though. Not in her bones. Not in the pit of her stomach, where the feeling of something lurking just beneath the surface began to grow again. Her parents seemed to buy her excuse. They always did. But that night, as she lay in bed, the darkness seemed thicker than it had been before. She kept the lights on, but the shadows in her room still felt wrong. The hum, the faint buzzing sound, was back, coming from nowhere, or maybe everywhere. It wasn't just the sound of the house. It felt like it was inside her own head. She tried to ignore it. She tried to close her eyes and sleep. But sleep didn't come. Hours passed. The hum grew louder. Lena finally couldn't stand it anymore. She slipped out of bed and crept to the window. Outside, the moon was full, casting silver light over the landscape, and everything seemed eerily still. She could see the outline of the old house on the hill, the broken windows reflecting the pale light. It almost looked alive, like it was breathing, exhaling in the cold air. The air in her room felt heavy, charged. The house seemed to draw her in, as if it wanted her to return. Lena backed away from the window, her breath catching in her throat. It was then she heard something. A soft voice. "Come back. Come back." It was her. The little girl. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, her blood running cold. She hadn't heard that voice in person, but she knew it, and she knew it had followed her. She knew what was coming. The girl's whisper drifted through the cracks in the walls, the thin layer of reality that Lena had been clinging to unraveling before her eyes. The air thickened, and the faint flicker of a shadow passed by the corner of her eye. Lena whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, but she could feel it. The presence. It's here. It's already here. She took a step back, her mind reeling. What had she done? What had she awakened? The house had never really been abandoned. It had been waiting for someone, waiting for her. Her parents' voices, muffled through the walls, offered no comfort. They weren't here. They couldn't protect her from whatever was coming. The floorboards creaked, and Lena froze. She glanced at the door. The knob twisted. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it, a shadow, stretching across the floor, creeping under the door. The outline of a little figure, too small to be anything other than the girl. Slowly, so slowly, the door began to open, just a crack, and the voice whispered again. "Come back to me." Lena didn't think. She bolted. She ran toward the stairs, her footsteps loud against the wooden floor. But as she turned the corner, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, at the foot of the stairs, was the girl. Her pale face was expressionless, her dark eyes hollow pools of emptiness. She was standing still, perfectly still, but Lena could feel the coldness radiating from her, like a freezing wind. The girl's mouth parted, and the same whisper escaped her lips. "You can't escape me." "You never could." Lena backed away slowly, her heart pounding. She was cornered, and no matter which way she turned, the girl was there. Behind her, the house seemed to shift, as if it were alive, its walls pressing inward, suffocating her with its dark presence. "No," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "No, please." But the girl only smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent a jolt of terror through Lena's entire body. "You'll never leave," the girl said. "You're mine now." The room grew impossibly cold. And then, in the blink of an eye, Lena felt the air around her change. It wasn't the house anymore, it wasn't just the girl. There was something deeper, something older, watching, waiting. And as the shadows closed in, Lena realized the truth. She hadn't just found the girl. The girl had found her. And now, Lena was part of the house. Forever. Lena stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, the coldness of the room crawling under her skin. She had backed herself into a corner, but the girl, that pale, hollow-eyed figure, stood blocking her path, a silent sentinel in the darkened hallway. The house, no, it wasn't just a house anymore. It was something else, something that lived, and it was watching, waiting. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, breathing in time with the low hum that vibrated through the air. The shadows stretched longer than they should, creeping toward her, as if they too were alive. The girl smiled, that same twisted grin, her lips curling back to reveal sharp, too perfect teeth. "You're mine now," she whispered, her voice a low, mocking melody that echoed off the walls. The words felt like ice, sharp and suffocating. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps, her mind racing. "I have to escape. I have to get out." But with each passing second, the air grew heavier, the shadows darker. The girl hadn't moved, yet Lena felt the oppressive weight of her presence, as though she was already inside her mind, burrowing deep into her thoughts. The coldness reached into Lena's chest, seeping into her very soul. It was like the house was swallowing her, piece by piece. "This isn't real," she thought desperately, her mind grasping at straws. "I'm dreaming. It's all a dream. Wake up, Lena. Wake up." But nothing changed. The hum only grew louder, and the girl's grin widened, impossibly wide. The shadows around her deepened, swallowing up the light, until Lena could see nothing but the girl's eyes, those dark, empty wells that seemed to stretch on forever. "You thought you could leave," the girl whispered, tilting her head to one side. "But you can't. You never could." Lena's breath hitched, her heart aching in her chest. The girl took a slow step forward, and with each movement, the walls seemed to close in tighter around her. The air was thick, suffocating, like the house was collapsing in on itself, folding around them. "Please," Lena gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "I just want to go home. Please, I just want to leave." But the girl's smile only grew, more twisted, more sinister. "You can't leave," she said, her voice full of malice. "Not now. You're a part of me now. A part of the house. A part of the dark." Lena's legs gave out beneath her. She crumpled to the floor, her eyes wide with terror as she stared up at the girl, unable to tear her gaze away. The shadows seemed to swallow everything, her, the room, the house itself, until there was only darkness. And then it happened. The world tilted. Time seemed to stretch and twist. The hum, that constant, maddening sound, suddenly stopped. For a single fleeting moment, there was nothing. No noise, no shadow, no girl. And then the silence shattered. The walls, the very air around Lena, seemed to crack apart, breaking open like fragile glass. Her heart pounded in her ears as the room swirled and twisted like a kaleidoscope of memories and forgotten things, each turn more distorted than the last. She felt herself falling through endless layers of darkness. She reached out, grasping at nothing, feeling herself slipping through the cracks of reality. And then a voice. A whisper. It was faint, almost drowned out by the chaos around her, but Lena recognized it. The girl. "Welcome home." Lena screamed, her voice joining the hum, the final sound before the dark overtook everything. The house breathed. It shifted. It was alive. And Lena was no longer a visitor. She was part of it now forever,